Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the News Hub. I'm Simon Constable. We have some developing news on the crisis in Iraq. While the fighting rages in Syria, warplanes from that country have been bombing Sunni insurgents in western Iraq. The move comes at the same time the first batch of U.S. military advisors are in place in Baghdad, Iraq. The irony is now that Syria's dictator Assad and the U.S. are on the same side, fighting the militants known as ISIS. To discuss this more, we have Andrew Tabler, Washington Institute Senior Fellow. Andrew, thanks for joining us once again.
My pleasure.
This has got to be one of the biggest ironies so far in this war. We've already know that Iran and the U.S. seem to be on the same side fighting these ISIS militants. Now we've got Syria too.
Yeah, I think it's actually an indication that perhaps Iran and the U.S. might see this more closely. Actually, until now, the Assad regime hasn't seldomly, if ever, attacked ISIS. They're very far. Their troops are very far away from where ISIS areas are. So I think both probably the Iranians and the United States are saying, Assad, it's about time. That's not going to clean up the situation on the ground, though, politically, and interesting development. See how it pans out.
And Andrew, why is it important to Syria to fight these militants in any way? They've got an entire civil war going on within its own borders, and I realize the borders are somewhat loose. It's not kind of like some of the European countries where there are sort of very defined borders. But why would it benefit him to do this?
Because he needs Iranian support in the West. Over the last few days, as the attacks by ISIS in Iraq have pushed on Baghdad, a lot of the Shia militias that Iran organized, many of those militiamen came from Iraq, left western Syria where they were fighting the rebels and went back to Iraq. Suddenly, the Syrian opposition sprung back up and started fighting against Assad's troops and retook a number of areas. It's a regionalized war. Assad now, I think, is directly striking at the behest of the Iranians, but it really shows how much this conflict is no longer just about Iraq or Syria, but it's about both.
Okay, now one of the things we're finding here at home in the U.S. is that only 1 in 5, 22% of Americans think the Iraq war was worth fighting. We were there an awful long time, and this is what has happened. Does that make sense to you? Does that fit? I was surprised it was so high. I mean, looking at this mess, some could argue that it would have been better without going in at all.
Well, I think it's hard to go back and change history. Certainly people's opinion of the Iraq war extremely negative, mostly at, I think, the way the U.S. conducted the war. Now, that, though, doesn't deal with emerging threats. And unless we do deal with the jihadist threat in Iraq and in Syria, and at the same time, I think that the world is a much less safe place, and particularly for American interests, both in the region, but also in Europe and in North America. And I think that's the reason why the Obama administration is reluctantly and being dragged into doing more in the region, even though the president himself in particular does not want to.
I'm sure he doesn't. I mean, it's not very popular at home to send troops back to a war that very few people seem to think was worthwhile. It seems that we're going to, whatever happens, we're going to see the entire Middle East reshaped. I mean, 100 years ago, at the end of the First World War, we saw the Middle East and a lot of the world reshaped. How do you think this is going to play out? Are we going to defeat the attempted caliphate? Where does it go?
I don't think we can defeat the attempted caliphate unless we do a lot more. The United States, I think, and most Americans in particular, don't want to rule the world, but they have major interests there. The U.S. underwrites a lot of the security architecture in the region, which underpins the energy supplies, which dictates price of energy. But I think the biggest thing now is just the terrorist threat, whether it's on the side of the jihadists on the Sunni side, or even now we have jihadists on the Shia side fighting on behalf of the Iranians. This is a conflict that we can ignore, but it won't go away. And moaning about what happened during the Iraq War is not going to deal with emerging threats. And that's what the Obama administration and future administrations are going to be focused on.
Okay, ignore it at our peril. Thank you very much, Andrew Tabler, Washington Institute Senior Fellow. We appreciate your time, sir.
My pleasure.